The wind did not just blow in the Dakota Territory. It scoured. It was a living thing with teeth, a relentless presence that chewed on the corners of the sod and timber cabins until the wood turned gray, and the earth crumbled back into dust. It was the year 1884, and the sky above the high plains felt too large for a man to occupy without being swallowed whole. There was no shelter from it. Not really. Even inside, with the door barred and the stove iron ticking with heat, the wind found a way to whistle through the chinking, reminding anyone foolish enough to live there that they were merely guests on land that did not want them. Caleb Mercer sat on the edge of his bed and listened to the wind hunt. He was 29 years old, though the sun and the hard years had carved lines into his face that belonged to a man of 40. He was lean, built of wire and rawhide, with hands that were perpetually stained by soil and grease. His cabin was a rough thing, smelling of green-cut pine, damp earth, and the lingering scent of burned coffee. It was not a home. It was a shelter, a box to keep the weather out. And tonight, it felt smaller than usual. He leaned forward to unlace his boots, the leather stiff with dried mud. His weight shifted, just a fraction, and the silence of the room was shattered by a sharp, tearing crack. The world tilted. The rope supports beneath the mattress gave way, snapping under the strain of wood rot and poor carpentry. The frame, cobbled together from warped scavenged lumber, twisted violently. Cal hit the floor hard, his shoulders slamming into the rough planks, the mattress folding over him like a suffocating tongue. He lay there for a moment in the sudden stillness, staring up at the darkened rafters. He did not curse. He did not shout. He simply closed his eyes and let out a long, ragged breath. It was such a small thing, a broken bed, but in the vast, empty silence of his life, it felt like a judgment. He shoved the mattress aside and stood up, his shoulder throbbing. He could have slept on the floor. He could have left it for morning. But a stubborn, burning pride flared in his chest, hot and irrational. He would not sleep on the floor of his own house like a dog. He dragged the broken frame outside into the failing light. The wind snatched at his hat, and he pulled it low. He had no proper lumber to fix it, so he gathered what he had: rusted baling wire, a handful of bent nails, and a few scraps of fence post. He worked near the front of the cabin, the hammer ringing out against the vast emptiness of the plains. The road to town ran past his claim, a ribbon of dirt packed down by wagon wheels and hooves. It was bad luck, or perhaps just the way Cal's life went, that the Crouch brothers were riding back from the livery just then. There were 3 of them, men who wore their loudness like a badge of honor, their saddles creaking as they slowed their horses. Cal did not look up, but he felt their eyes. He kept twisting the wire, his fingers bleeding where the metal bit into his skin. "Well, look at that," Silas Crouch called out, his voice carrying easily over the wind. "The Mercer estate is undergoing renovations." The brothers laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Sleeping rough tonight, Cal?" another brother shouted. "Or did the ghosts finally kick you out of bed?" Cal drove a nail into the wood with a single, violent strike. He said nothing. He never said anything. That was the fuel for their fire. If he had shouted back, they might have moved on, but his silence made them cruel. They sat on their horses, watching him struggle with the broken junk, watching him try to bind the splintered wood with wire because he could not afford new timber. "Don't worry, boys," Silas said, wheeling his horse around. "He don't need a bed anyway. Who's he got to keep warm? He'll die alone in that shack, just like we said he would, freezing to death on a dirt floor." They rode off, their laughter drifting back like smoke, hanging in the air long after they were gone. Cal finished the job. The bed was ugly, a scarred mess of wire and mismatched wood. But it held. He dragged it back inside, his chest tight with a humiliation that felt disproportionate to the event. It was not just the poverty. Every man in the territory had known lean years. It was the loneliness. It was the terrifying realization that the Crouch brothers were right. He was disappearing. He would work this land until his back broke, and if he died in his sleep, it might be weeks before anyone noticed. The silence of the cabin was not peaceful. It was predatory. It waited for him to stop moving so it could consume him. He sat on the mended bed, the wire digging into the mattress ticking, and looked at the tin box on the shelf. Inside was the letter he had sent 3 months ago to a newspaper in Chicago. It had been a surrender. He had written it with a shaking hand. Drinking cheap whiskey to dull the shame of it. Wanted. A wife. For purpose of partnership on a homestead. Must be of strong character. I have 160 acres and a cabin. I ask for hard work and offer a decent home. Respectfully. Caleb Mercer. It was not romance. It was survival. He needed someone to tend the garden while he ran the fence line. He needed someone to cook so he did not starve during the harvest. He needed to know that if a horse kicked him or a fever took him, there would be someone to fetch the doctor. But beneath the practicality, buried deep under the scar tissue of his stoicism, there was a wound that had never healed. 7 years ago, on a cattle drive up from Texas, a boy had died. A stampede in the mud. A moment of hesitation on Cal's part, and the boy had been crushed. It was an accident. Everyone said so. But Cal had seen the look in the trail boss's eyes. He had seen the way men stopped talking when he entered a room. He carried that death like a stone in his gut. He kept his eyes down, spoke only when spoken to, and punished himself with isolation. But the isolation was turning dangerous. He found himself staring at his rifle in the evenings, wondering what the barrel tasted like. He found himself walking too close to the canyon edge. He needed a tether. He needed a reason to get up when the winter dark stayed all day. He needed Eliza Hart, though he did not know her name yet. 2,000 miles away, the air did not smell of pine and dust. It smelled of coal smoke, wet wool, and the sour reek of too many people living in too little space. Eliza Hart stood at the window of a boarding house in Chicago, looking down at the gray slush of the street. She was 24, with hair the color of dark walnut and eyes that were always watching the door. Her hands were rough, the skin around her fingernails stained with the indigo dye of the textile mill where she had worked for 6 years. She was tired. It was a bone-deep exhaustion that sleep could not touch, but fear was a stronger stimulant than coffee. The door to her room had a heavy bolt she had paid a blacksmith to install. Draining her savings for the week, it was necessary. The man who owned the boarding house, a Mr. O'Doyle, had keys to every room, and he had begun to linger in the hallway when she came home. He had begun to make comments about her rent being late, even when it was not. He had begun to touch her shoulder as she passed, his fingers squeezing too hard, his breath smelling of gin. Eliza knew that look. She knew where it led. She had seen it in the factory foreman's eyes before she fled New York. And she saw it now. She was trapped. The wages at the mill were barely enough to buy bread and coal. She could not afford to move. She had no family. The influenza had taken them a decade ago. She was a woman alone in a city that fed on the weak, and the walls were closing in. She turned from the window and looked at the newspaper clipping on her narrow table. It was crinkled, worn soft from being folded and unfolded 100 times. Wanted a wife. It was madness. To get on a train and ride into the wilderness to marry a stranger. It was the kind of thing desperate women did. Eliza Hart was a desperate woman. She packed her life into a single carpet bag, 2 dresses, a Bible she couldn't bring herself to read, a small sewing kit, and a knife she had sharpened on a whetstone until it could slice paper. She did not pack for a wedding. She packed for a war. She pinned the ticket to the inside of her coat. She waited until the boarding house was quiet, until the heavy footsteps of Mr. O'Doyle had faded down the hall. And then she slipped out. She did not leave a note. The city did not care where she went, and she did not care to tell it. The train ride took 5 days. It was a journey that stripped the world away, layer by layer. The trees thinned out, the cities dissolved into towns, the towns shrank into settlements, and finally, there was nothing but the earth and the sky. When the conductor called out the name of the station, Granite Springs, Eliza felt a spike of panic so sharp it nearly doubled her over. She smoothed her skirt, pinched her cheeks to bring some color into her pale face. and stepped onto the platform. The air hit her first. It was thin and sharp, devoid of moisture, carrying the scent of sagebrush. The light was blinding. The horizon was a flat, brutal line that seemed to go on forever. Compared to the claustrophobia of the city, this openness felt like exposure. There was nowhere to hide. She scanned the platform. There were a few people milling about. A woman in a bonnet clutching a basket. 2 men loading crates. But her eyes landed on a man standing near the edge of the wooden planks. He was holding a battered hat in his hands, turning the brim in nervous circles. He wore a canvas coat that had been mended at the elbows, and his boots were gray with dust. He looked like part of the landscape, rough-hewn and weathered. Eliza walked toward him. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her chin high. She had practiced this walk. It was the walk of a woman who was not afraid, even if it was a lie. "Are you Caleb?" she asked. The man jumped slightly, as if he hadn't seen her approach. He looked at her, and Eliza saw something in his eyes that surprised her. She had expected hardness. She had expected the leering assessment she was used to from men. Instead, she saw terror. He looked like a man who was afraid he was about to be told he had made a mistake. "I am," he said. His voice was gravel, unused to long sentences. "You are Miss Hart. Eliza, Eliza," he repeated, testing the word. He nodded. "Once, sharply, 'The wagon is this way.'" He did not offer to take her bag. He seemed unsure if he was allowed to touch her property. He simply turned and walked toward a buckboard wagon hitched to 2 sturdy, unremarkable horses. Eliza followed him. The town of Granite Springs was not much of a town. A single main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a livery stable, a church with a modest steeple, and a general store that seemed to serve as the center of the universe. As Cal helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand barely grazing her elbow, snatching back as if burned, Eliza felt the weight of the town's attention. It was immediate and physical. 2 women standing outside the mercantile stopped talking mid-sentence. They turned their heads in unison, their eyes narrowing. A group of men lounging on the porch of the saloon straightened up. "That her?" one of the men said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Must be. Look at the shoes. City shoes." A younger man grinned, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Mail order." "Reckon she knows about the bed?" Laughter rippled through the group. It was low and mean, the sound of people who had very little entertainment and were grateful for a victim. Eliza stiffened. She looked at Cal. His jaw was set so hard she could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. He stared straight ahead at the horse's ears, refusing to look at the men. "Yeah," he said softly, snapping the reins. The wagon lurched forward. As they rolled past the church, Eliza saw the women leaning together, whispering behind gloved hands. She heard the word desperate and the word trash floating on the wind. She did not look down. She looked at the horizon. She had left a city where she was prey to come to a wilderness where she was a joke. It was a lateral move. She decided. The ride to the cabin took 2 hours. They barely spoke. Cal seemed paralyzed by the presence of a woman on his wagon seat, and Eliza was too busy cataloging the landscape to make small talk. She saw the dried creek beds, the scrubby brush, the hawk circling overhead. It was beautiful in a cruel way. It looked like land that would kill you if you stopped paying attention for a single second. The cabin sat in the lee of a low hill. It was smaller than she had imagined. The logs were dark with age, and the roof was covered in sod, grass growing out of the dirt overhead. Cal pulled the horses up and set the brake. "Home," he said, the words sounding like an apology. He helped her down, and this time his grip was firmer. He carried her bag to the door and pushed it open. The inside was dim. The single window was small, letting in a square of dusty light. There was a cast-iron stove in the corner, a table with 2 mismatched chairs, and shelves lined with tins. The floor was packed earth, swept clean but uneven. And there was the bed. It dominated the room. It was a strange, scarred thing, the wood obviously spliced together with wire and mismatched nails. It looked like it had been broken and put back together by a man in a rage or a panic. Eliza looked at it, then at Cal. He took off his hat and hung it on a peg near the door. He turned to face her, wiping his hands on his trousers. I fixed it, he said, his voice thick with embarrassment. The frame. It gave out a few days back. It's sturdy now. Eliza nodded slowly. She understood the laughter in town now. They knew. Everyone knew everything out here. It looks fine, she said. Cal looked at the floor. There is only the one room. I aim to build on. Come spring, a proper room for you. He walked over to the corner where a pile of blankets sat on a wooden crate. I'll take the floor, he said. You take the bed. It's got a fresh tick. Stuffed it with clean straw yesterday. Eliza looked at the man. He was standing with his shoulders hunched, bracing himself for her disgust. He expected her to weep. He expected her to demand a ticket back to Chicago. He was offering her the bed like a peace offering, trying to buy her patience with his own discomfort. She thought of the boarding house. She thought of Mr. O'Doyle's hand on her shoulder. She thought of the shame that had followed her for years, the feeling that she was something to be used or pitied. No, she said. Cal looked up, startled. Ma'am, I said no, Eliza said, her voice firm. She unbuttoned her coat and laid it over the back of a chair. I did not come here to be a guest, Caleb, and I did not come here to take your bed while you sleep in the dirt like a dog. Cal frowned. It ain't right. You're a lady. I am a wife, Eliza said, though the word felt strange in her mouth. Or I will be, once the preacher comes. Until then, I am a partner. This is a partnership, is it not? That is what the advertisement said. It is, Cal said. Then we start as we mean to go on. I am not invalid. I am not fragile. She walked over to the bed. She pressed her hand against the mattress. It crunched softly. We will figure out the sleeping, she said. But do not treat me like china. I will break if you drop me, perhaps, but I will not break from living. She turned to face him. The wind outside picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin, making the lantern flame on the table tremble in its glass chimney. The light flickered over their faces, casting long, dancing shadows against the logs. For a moment, neither of them moved. They were strangers, trapped in a box of wood and mud, surrounded by miles of nothing. Eliza could hear him breathing. It was a steady, heavy sound. She could smell the soap he had used to wash, a sharp scent of lye that barely covered the smell of the horses. She saw him look at her, really look at her, for the first time. He did not look at her body with hunger. He looked at her face. He looked at the set of her jaw. He looked confused, as if he had ordered a plow and received a telescope. Cal turned his face away, staring at the dark wall. He shifted his weight, and Eliza saw the tension in his neck. He did not trust himself. He was afraid of his own presence, afraid that his roughness would contaminate her. Eliza felt a strange sensation in her chest. It was not love. It was certainly not lust. It was safety. This man was not a predator. He was a frightened animal, just like her. And in that shared fear, there was room to breathe. I can cook, Eliza said, breaking the silence. If you have flour. Cal nodded, still not looking at her. I have flour and salt pork. Then I will make supper, she said. She rolled up her sleeves, revealing the pale undersides of her wrists, scarred faintly from the loom shuttles. She moved to the stove. She did not know how to use this wood-burning beast. Not really, but she would learn. She would learn it all. The next morning, the sun rose cold and bright. The wind had died down to a whisper, leaving the world suspended in a crystal silence. Cal was already outside. Eliza had heard him leave before dawn. The quiet creak of the door, the only sign he was gone. She had slept on the bed, fully clothed, wrapped in her coat. He had slept on the floor, despite her protest. They had not argued further. He had simply laid his blankets down and blown out the lantern. She rose and smoothed her dress. She splashed water on her face from the basin and opened the door. Cal was by the corral, mending a section of fence. He stopped when he saw her. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed, but he nodded to her. Coffee's hot, he said. Eliza stepped out onto the hard-packed earth. The air was delicious. It tasted of frost and sage. She looked toward the road. A wagon was coming. It was the Crouch brothers again, along with a few others from town, a supply run, likely. They were slowing down as they approached the cabin, their face eager for a show. They wanted to see the city girl crying. They wanted to see the poor cowboy humiliated again. Cal tensed. He gripped the hammer in his hand, his knuckles white. He looked ready to shrink, to turn his back and let the insults wash over him like rain. Eliza stepped off the porch. She walked across the yard, her boots crunching in the frost. She went to where Cal stood. She did not touch him. That would be too much, too soon, but she stood beside him. She stood close enough that her skirt brushed against his leg. She folded her hands in front of her and looked at the approaching wagon. She did not glare. She did not scowl. She simply looked at them. She looked at Silas Crouch with the same flat, unyielding stare she had used on the foreman at the mill. It was a look that said, "I see you. You are small. You do not matter." The wagon slowed. Silas opened his mouth to shout something, a joke about the bed, a jeer about the cold night, but the words died in his throat. He saw the woman standing there. She was small, pale, and looked like a strong wind would blow her to Kansas. But she was standing like a fence post. She was claiming this patch of dirt, and she was claiming the man beside her. Silas frowned. He looked at Cal, who was staring at Eliza with a mixture of shock and awe. The dynamic had shifted. The joke wasn't funny if the victims didn't bleed. "Morning," Silas muttered, tipping his hat awkwardly. He snapped the reins, and the wagon rolled on, the wheels creaking in the silence. Cal let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. He looked down at Eliza. "They'll be back," he said quietly. "Let them." Eliza said. She watched the wagon disappear over the rise. She looked at the vast, terrifying horizon, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel like running. She turned to Cal. "The fence needs fixing. Caleb, and I believe I saw a hoe in the shed. The garden won't plant itself." Cal looked at her. A slow, hesitant smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was rusty, unused, but it was there. "No, ma'am," he said. "I reckon it won't." He picked up a box of nails and held it out. She took a handful, and together, under the massive, indifferent sky, they turned their backs on the road and went to work. The cabin began to change, though the changes were small enough that a stranger might not have noticed them. The dust, which had previously coated every surface in a fine, gray silt, was now waged war against daily. Eliza Hart fought the Dakota Territory with a broom made of stiff straw and a rag that never seemed to dry. She scrubbed the floorboards until the wood grain emerged from beneath years of neglect. She patched Cal's spare shirt, the needle moving in and out of the heavy flannel with the precision of a woman who had spent half her life in a textile mill. But the land did not like being tamed. It fought back with a passive, ancient malice. The soil in the small garden patch Cal had broken up for her was hard as iron. When Eliza knelt to plant the few withered potato eyes and bean seeds she had found in a tin, the ground seemed to repel the spade. The sun was a physical weight on her shoulders, burning the back of her neck raw within 10 minutes. It was a harsh education. Eliza learned that water was not a right but a negotiation. Every drop had to be hauled from the creek, which was running lower with every week of the drought. She learned that the wind could strip the moisture from laundry in an hour, but leave the fabric stiff with grit. She learned that the silence of the high plains at night was not empty. It was heavy, pressing against the eardrums, filled with the yips of coyotes that sounded like laughing children. Cal watched her efforts with a wary, quiet distance. He worked harder than she had ever seen a man work, as if he were trying to outrun his own presence in the cabin. He rose before the sun, the coffee pot rattling on the stove his only greeting, and he often did not return until the light was gone. He ate the meals she cooked, stews thickened with flour, biscuits that were improving but still dense, with his head down, murmuring a polite thanks before retreating to mend gear or sharpen tools. He was afraid of her. Eliza saw it in the way he hugged the walls when he walked past her. ensuring their clothes did not brush. He believed he was a contagion. He believed that his poverty and his past were a rot that would spread to her if he let himself get too close. He treated her with a terrifying courtesy, like she was a fragile porcelain doll he had accidentally ordered and was terrified of breaking before he could return it. "We need supplies," Cal said one evening, 3 weeks after her arrival. He was staring at his hands, picking at a callus. "The flour is low, and I need wire." Eliza looked up from her mending. "I will come with you." Cal hesitated. "There is no need. The ride is long. I need thread. Caleb. And I need to see where we live. I cannot stare at these 4 walls until winter comes." He did not argue. He never argued. He simply nodded, the gesture resigning him to her company. The trip to town the next morning was stiff with silence. The wagon jounced over the ruts, the sun hammering down on the canvas shade. When they rolled into Granite Springs, the atmosphere shifted. The air in the town felt tight, charged with the static of idle minds. They walked into the general store, the bell above the door jangling cheerfully. It was a lie. The interior smelled of sawdust and vinegar, and the silence that fell when they entered was absolute. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, was a man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing. He stood behind the counter, wiping his hands on a stained apron. 2 women were inspecting bolts of calico near the window. They turned, their whispers stopping abruptly, their eyes raking over Eliza's dress, her hair, her boots. "Mr. Mercer," Henderson said, his voice flat. "Back so soon?" "Need wire," Cal said, keeping his voice low. "And flour, 50 pounds. Henderson nodded, moving slowly to fetch the goods. Eliza stepped forward, holding a small coin purse she had brought from Chicago. It contained the last of her own money. "I require thread. Mr. Henderson, black cotton, and a packet of needles." Henderson looked at her. He did not smile. He reached under the counter and slapped a spool of thread and a paper packet onto the wood. "That will be 40 cents. The price was high, nearly double what it should have been. Eliza knew it. Henderson knew she knew it. She placed a 50-cent piece on the counter. Henderson took it, dropped it into his cash drawer, and turned away to weigh Cal's flour. "My change, Mr. Henderson," Eliza said. Her voice was quiet but clear. Henderson paused. He looked back at her, his eyebrows raising in mock surprise. "Change? I thought that was for the jar, for the poor." He gestured vaguely to a jar on the counter. The women by the window tittered. A sharp, bird-like sound. "I am the poor, Mr. Henderson," Eliza said, holding his gaze. 10 cents. The shopkeeper's face reddened. He opened the drawer and slammed a dime onto the counter. Eliza picked it up, her fingers steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped moth. As they left the store, carrying the heavy sacks, the women's voices floated out behind them. "Bold thing, isn't she? Well, she has to be. Look what she married into." They stepped out onto the boardwalk, the sun blinding after the dim interior. A man was standing by their wagon, running a gloved hand over the flank of Cal's lid horse. He was a tall man, dressed in a suit that cost more than Cal's entire homestead. His vest was silk, his boots were polished to a mirror shine, and his hat was pristine gray felt. He had a face that might have been handsome if not for the eyes. They were pale blue, cold, and possessed a predatory patience. Silas Rourke. Cal stopped, his posture shifting instantly. He became rigid, his shoulders drawing up. "Mr. Rourke," Cal said. "Caleb," Rourke said, his voice smooth like oil pouring over gravel. "Good to see you. Stock looks a little thin." "It's a dry year," Cal said. "It is." Rourke agreed. He turned his attention to Eliza. He did not look at her as the townspeople did, with scorn. He looked at her with appraisal. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he intends to break. And this must be the new Mrs. "Mercer, Eliza Hart," Eliza said, correcting him before she could stop herself. Rourke smiled. It was a terrifying expression. It did not reach his eyes. Eliza Mercer. Surely, unless Caleb here hasn't done the job right. The insinuation hung in the air, gross and heavy. Cal took a step forward, dropping the flour sack into the wagon bed with a heavy thud. "We are married," Cal said, his voice tight. "Of course," Rourke said, raising a hand. "No offense meant. I just heard stories. You know how this town talks? They say you are patching up more than just your fences these days." He stepped closer, invading their space without moving his feet. "I was just telling the sheriff," Rourke continued, nodding toward the jailhouse where a man with a tin star was leaning against a post, watching them with bored disinterest, "that it is a shame about the water. My creek is running fine, but yours comes from the upper ridge. If that dries up, Caleb, you won't be able to keep a wife. Let alone a herd. I have water rights," Cal said. "Paper is just paper." "Son," Rourke said softly, "when the land gets thirsty, paper burns." He tipped his hat to Eliza. "Ma'am, if you ever find the accommodations up on the ridge too, austere, my door is always open. I employ a cook. You wouldn't have to scrub floors." He walked away, his boot heels clicking rhythmically on the wood. The sheriff watched him go, then spat into the dust and went back inside his office. The alignment was clear. Money spoke to power, and poverty was left to listen. Cal stood frozen for a moment. Then he climbed into the wagon, his movements jerky and angry. "Get in," he said. The weeks that followed were a grind of labor, to pay for the wire and the seed. Cal took day work at the Miller Ranch, 10 miles south. He left before dawn and returned after dark, his body bruised and exhausted from breaking colts and digging post holes. Eliza refused to stay behind every day. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, she insisted on going with him. "I will not sit in that cabin and wait for the wind to blow it down." She told him, "I can cook for the hands. I can mend tack." Cal tried to refuse, but Eliza was immovable. She rode on the wagon seat beside him, wrapping her shawl tight against the morning chill. She saw him work. She saw the way he handled the horses, not with cruelty, but with a firm, quiet language of touch and pressure. She saw the way other men looked at him, with dismissal, but also with a grudging respect for his ability to take pain without complaint. Trust began to build, not in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of small moments. Eliza learned that Cal drank his coffee black because sugar was expensive, not because he liked it. She learned that he hummed a low, tuneless melody when he was nervous. Cal learned her, too. He noticed that she flinched when a door slammed. He learned that she could not stand the smell of whiskey, so he stopped taking the occasional pull from the flask he kept in the barn. He learned that when she went quiet, she was not angry. She was thinking. One evening, the wind died down, and the cold settled in hard. Cal built a fire in the stove, leaving the door open so they could watch the flames. They sat in the two mismatched chairs, the silence between them comfortable for the first time. "You handle a horse well," Eliza said. "I watched you today with that roan mare." "She was scared," Cal said, staring at the fire. "Fear makes a thing dangerous. You have to show her she doesn't need to fight you." "Is that what you're doing?" Eliza asked. "With me?" Cal looked at her, startled. He opened his mouth to deny it, then closed it. He looked back at the fire. "I don't know what I'm doing with you, Eliza. I never expected you to stay. I had nowhere else to go," she said. "That isn't true," Cal said. "A woman like you. You could have found work in the city. You didn't have to come to this empty place." Eliza looked at her hands. The firelight danced on her skin. "I ran. Caleb." He did not interrupt. He waited. "There was a man," she said, "the son of the factory owner. He decided I was his. He didn't ask. He just took up all the space around me. He made it so I couldn't breathe. And when I told him no, he made sure I lost my shift. He made sure the landlord raised my rent. He was going to starve me into saying yes." She looked up at Cal. Her eyes were dry, but hard. "I am not afraid of work. I am not afraid of hunger, but I will not be owned." Cal nodded slowly. He understood that. He understood the feeling of a trap closing around your leg. "I know what it is to run," he said softly. "I didn't run from a man. I ran from a moment. 7 years ago, I made a mistake, and a boy died. I see his face every time I close my eyes. I came here because it was empty. I thought if I went far enough, the memory wouldn't follow. Did it work? Eliza asked. No, Cal said. It rides double with me, every day. He looked at the bed in the corner. The wire-bound frame looked grotesque in the flickering light. I will build you a proper bed, he said suddenly. When the cattle sell, or when I get the pay from Miller. Oak with turned posts. Strong. Eliza looked at the bed, then at him. The bed holds. Caleb. Strength is not only made of wood, it is made of enduring. The crisis came 4 days later. It was a Tuesday. Cal was working on the corral fence, trying to leverage a massive pine log into place as a top rail. The ground was slick with morning frost. Eliza was in the garden, turning the soil. She heard the shout, short, sharp, and then a sickening thud. She dropped the hoe and ran. Cal was on the ground. The log, hundreds of pounds of dead weight, had slipped and pinned his left leg against the lower rail. He was pale. His teeth gritted so hard she could hear them grinding. He was not making a sound, but his eyes were wide with shock. Caleb! Eliza threw herself at the log. She was small, but panic gave her a frantic, hysterical strength. She jammed her shoulder under the wood, her boots slipping in the mud. Push! She screamed. Cal groaned, bracing his good leg and shoving backward. Eliza heaved, her vision spotting with effort. The log shifted, just an inch, then rolled free with a heavy crash. Cal slumped back into the mud, gasping. His leg was twisted at a bad angle below the knee. Eliza did not faint. She did not cry. The world narrowed down to the immediate problem. We have to get you inside, she said. I can walk. Cal wheezed. You cannot. Put your arm around my neck. It took 20 minutes to cross the 50 yards to the cabin. Eliza bore his weight, her knees buckling, her breath coming in sobbing gasps. She dragged him more than walked him. When they finally reached the door, she collapsed him onto the bed, her bed, and fell to her knees beside him. She cut the boot off. The leg was broken, badly bruised, but the bone had not broken the skin. She knew enough to know that was a mercy. She needed a doctor, but the town was 2 hours away by wagon, and she could not lift him into the wagon. She had to set it. She looked at Cal. He was gray, sweat beading on his forehead. I have to pull it. Caleb, do it, he whispered. She braced her foot against the bed frame. She took his heel in her hands. She prayed to a God she hadn't spoken to in years, and she pulled. Cal screamed. It was a raw, animal sound that tore through the cabin. Then he passed out. Eliza bound the leg with strips of sheeting and splinted it with kindling wood. Then she collapsed into the chair and shook until her teeth rattled. For 3 days, the fever flirted with him. Cal burned hot, tossing on the mattress, muttering names Eliza did not know. Eliza did not sleep. She sat by the bed, sponging his forehead with cool water, dripping broth between his cracked lips. She managed the homestead alone. She fed the horses, chopped the wood, and hauled the water. She carried the shotgun when she went to the barn, her eyes scanning the horizon for Rourke or his men. She was exhausted, her body aching in places she didn't know existed, but she did not stop. On the 4th night, the fever broke. Cal woke up clear-headed. The pain settled into a dull throb. The cabin was dark, save for the low glow of the stove. The wind was howling outside, a blizzard threatening in the heavy air. He turned his head. Eliza was sitting in the chair next to the bed, her head resting on the mattress near his hand. She was asleep, her breathing soft and shallow. Cal looked at her. She looked so small. Her hair had come loose from its pins, spilling over her arm. She looked like she had been in a fight. Her hands were chapped, her face smudged with soot. She had stayed. She had dragged him in. She had saved him. A wave of emotion hit him, so strong it frightened him more than the log had. It was gratitude. Yes, but it was more. It was a hunger. Not just for her body, though that was there, lurking in the dark. It was a hunger for her presence. He wanted to know she was there. He wanted to be the man she deserved. He moved his hand. His fingers brushed against hers. Eliza stirred. She sat up instantly, her eyes snapping open. Caleb? You're awake. The fever. Gone, he rasped. His throat was like sandpaper. She reached for the tin cup on the floor. Here, drink. He drank, his eyes never leaving her face. She took the cup back and set it down. You should be sleeping, Cal said. I was afraid, she admitted. Her voice was small in the dark room. I was afraid you would die, and I would be alone here. You aren't alone, Cal said. He reached out. It was instinct. It was the starving man reaching for bread. He took her hand. Her skin was rough, calloused like his. It felt perfect. Eliza went still. She looked at their joined hands. Then she looked at him. The air in the room changed. The scent of sickness faded, replaced by the smell of wood smoke and the sharp, electric scent of two people who had been circling each other for weeks. Caleb, she whispered. He pulled on her hand, gently. Just a suggestion. She leaned in. She did not pull away. The kiss was not like the ones in the dime novels. It was not graceful. Cal was unshaven, his lips dry. Eliza smelled of worry and exhaustion. But when their mouths met, it was like a door slamming shut against the cold. It was relief. It was a surrender of the walls they had built. He tasted of life. She tasted of hope. He groaned low in his throat, his hand coming up to cup her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. She leaned into his touch, her fingers gripping his wrist, anchoring herself to him. They broke apart, breathless. They stared at each other, the reality of what had happened settling over them. It was dangerous. Desire was a complication they couldn't afford, but it was also the only thing that made sense. Lie down, Cal whispered. Beside me, please. Eliza hesitated only a second. She kicked off her boots. She climbed onto the narrow bed, careful of his leg. She lay beside him, on top of the quilt. He wrapped his arm around her. She buried her face in his shoulder. They did not do more. They could not with his injury, not with the storm outside, but they held each other. And for the first time in 7 years, Cal Mercer slept without dreaming of the dead. 2 weeks later, Cal was walking with a crutch he had whittled from an ash branch. He was slow, and the pain was a constant companion. But he was upright. We have to go to town, Cal said. Eliza looked up from the dough she was kneading. You cannot ride in a wagon. Caleb, the leg. We have to go, he repeated. It was Sunday. Why? Because Rourke will have told everyone I'm crippled. He'll be making moves on the water rights. And he leaned on his crutch, looking at her steadily. And because I want them to see us, Eliza wiped her hands on her apron. She understood. They took the wagon. Eliza drove, handling the team with a confidence that surprised her. Cal sat beside her, his leg propped up on a sack of grain, his face pale but set in stone. They arrived in Granite Springs just as the church service was letting out. The timing was deliberate. The entire town was spilling onto the main street. Eliza pulled the wagon up in front of the general store. The crowd slowed, eyes turned. The whispers started instantly. Look, it's him. Thought he was crushed. And her. Look at her driving like a man. Eliza set the brake. She hopped down and walked around to Cal's side. She offered him her shoulder. He took it. He lowered himself down, gritting his teeth against the agony. But he stood. He adjusted his crutch. Then he did something he had never done. He shifted his weight, freeing his arm, and he wrapped it around Eliza's waist. He pulled her close, not for support, but for possession. The crowd watched. Misses. Higgins gasped audibly. The sheriff stepped out of his office, his thumbs hooked in his belt. Silas Rourke stood near the hotel, a cigar in his mouth, his eyes narrowing. They expected shame. They expected the mail-order bride to be cowering, the poor cowboy to be broken. Instead, Cal Mercer stood tall, leaning on his wife, and Eliza Mercer stood with her head high, her hand resting comfortably on his chest. Let them look, Cal murmured to her. Eliza looked at the women who had called her desperate. She looked at Rourke, who had called her a plaything. We are here, she whispered back. They walked together toward the store, slow and limping, but moving forward. They were a scandal. They were a joke to some, a threat to others. But as they walked through the gauntlet of stairs, Eliza knew one thing for certain. They were no longer just surviving. They were a family, and they would fight. The wind kicked up dust in the street, swirling around their boots, but they did not blink. They had chosen the marriage. Now, they just had to survive the war that was coming. The autumn did not fall gently upon the high plains. It arrived with the subtlety of a whip crack. The golden haze of late summer was sheared away by winds that howled down from the north, carrying the scent of snow long before the first flake touched the ground. The sky turned the color of bruised iron, and the horizon, once a promise of infinite space, now felt like a closing cage. For Cal and Eliza Mercer, the shifting season was a race against time. The cabin, which had been a sieve for the wind when Eliza first arrived, was slowly transforming. Cal worked with a desperation that he masked as method. His leg was healing, though it still stiffened in the cold mornings, forcing him to walk with a hitch in his stride that he hated. But he did not let it stop him. He stripped the sodden, rotting thatch from the roof and replaced it with cedar shingles he had bartered for at the mill, trading 3 days of labor for a wagon load of wood. The smell of the fresh cedar was sharp and clean, cutting through the stale odor of old earth. He expanded the corral, replacing the makeshift willow branches with sturdy pine poles that could hold the weight of a spooked horse. Inside, the change was even more profound. They had purchased a new stove, a cast-iron beast that radiated heat long after the fire died down. It had cost them nearly every penny of Cal's earnings from the cattle drive. But the first night the temperature dropped below freezing, and the water in the basin stayed liquid. They knew it was worth the hunger they would face later. These improvements were small, practical things, yet to the eyes of Granite Springs, they looked like arrogance. The smoke curling from a proper chimney, the sound of a hammer ringing out against good timber. It smelled like hope, and in a land where failure was the common currency, hope from a man like Caleb Mercer was treated as a counterfeit coin. The pressure began subtly. It arrived in the form of Silas Rourke, riding up to their fence line on a black gelding that looked better fed than most of the town's children. Rourke did not shout. He sat easily in his saddle, his gloved hands resting on the horn, watching Cal dig a post hole. Eliza was nearby, gathering dried sagebrush for kindling. She straightened as Rourke approached, her hands tightening on the brittle branches. "Morning." "Caleb," Rourke said, his voice smooth and carrying easily over the wind. "Looks like you're digging in for the winter." "I am," Cal said. He did not stop digging. The spade bit into the half-frozen earth with a rhythmic crunch. "Hard winter coming," Rourke said pleasantly. "My foreman tells me the almanac predicts record snows. A man could get buried out here, especially a man with limited resources." "We have enough," Cal said. Rourke chuckled, a dry sound like dry leaves skittering on rock. "Enough is a tricky word. It changes fast when the drifts are 10 feet high." He leaned forward slightly. "I came to make you another offer, Caleb, a generous one. I'm looking to expand my grazing land to the west. I will give you $200 for the deed. You take the money, you take your pretty wife, and you move south. Arizona, maybe, somewhere the living is softer." $200 was a robbery. The water rights alone were worth 5 times that. "Not for sale," Cal said. He finally looked up, leaning on the shovel. Rourke's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went flat. "You are a stubborn man. I respect that. But you have a woman to think of now. This isn't a place for a lady. Not really. It is dangerous. Accidents happen. Water dries up. Sometimes. The law finds reasons to look closely at a man's affairs." He turned his gaze to Eliza. "Mrs. Mercer, you look tired. If you ever decide you want a warm room and a life that doesn't involve breaking your back for dust, you remember my offer. Some things are too pretty to be wasted on a losing bet." He tipped his hat and rode off, the black horse kicking up clods of dirt that landed near Cal's boots. Cal watched him go, his jaw set so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. He did not speak, but he drove the shovel into the earth with a violence that made the handle shudder. The threat was not empty. 2 days later, Cal was stopped on the road by Sheriff Brady. The lawman sat on his horse, blocking the path of Cal's wagon. He spent 20 minutes inspecting Cal's brand, checking the bill of sale for the flour in the wagon bed, and asking pointed questions about where Cal had been 3 nights prior. "Just doing my job." "Mercer," Brady said, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. "Had some reports of rustling. You know how it is. Poor men get desperate." "I don't steal," Cal said, his voice tight. Brady grinned. "Everyone steals. Caleb, some just haven't been caught yet. You watch your step." Cal recognized the trap. They were trying to provoke him. They wanted him to snap, to throw a punch or raise his voice, giving them the excuse to lock him up and leave Eliza alone on the claim. He swallowed his rage, tasting bile, and nodded. He had no power to fight them. Not yet. Eliza, meanwhile, was fighting a different battle. She knew that isolation was as deadly as the cold. If they were to survive, they needed more than wood and iron. They needed allies. She went to town on Wednesdays, driving the wagon herself. The women of the church circle, the wives of the merchants and the prosperous ranchers, gathered in the mercantile or the tea room. They turned their backs when she entered. They pulled their skirts aside as if she carried a plague. To them, she was a mail-order bride, a woman who had sold herself, and therefore beneath contempt. So Eliza looked elsewhere. She found Martha, the midwife, a woman with gray braids and hands that looked like twisted roots. Martha lived on the edge of town in a shack covered in drying herbs. She was tolerated because she was necessary, but she was not invited to tea. Eliza brought her a jar of wild plum jam she had made. Martha looked at the jam, then at Eliza. "I don't deliver for free," the midwife said gruffly. "I am not pregnant." Eliza said, "I just thought you might like some sweet." The plums were good this year. Martha grunted, but she opened the door. By the 3rd visit, she was teaching Eliza which bark stopped bleeding and which tea broke a fever. Eliza also found friendship in the alley behind the saloon. There, she met Thomas, a man with a twisted spine who swept the floors and emptied the spittoons. He had no family and spoke in a stammer that made others mock him. Eliza brought him a pair of wool socks she had knitted. "For me?" Thomas asked, clutching the socks as if they were gold. "Your boots are thin." "Thomas," Eliza said, "and the frost is hard." She befriended Widow Gable, a woman whose husband had died owing money to the bank, leaving her destitute and ignored. These were the discarded people of Granite Springs, the ones the town walked past without seeing. Eliza saw them. She learned their names, she listened to them, and in doing so, she learned that prejudice was a chain that bound many people, not just her and Cal. It was during one of the long, dark evenings in the cabin that the silence between Cal and Eliza finally broke in a way that could not be mended, only transformed. The wind was screaming outside, a high, thin wail that rattled the door latch. The new stove was glowing, casting a warm, red light across the room. Cal was oiling his saddle leather. Eliza was sewing a tear in the quilt. "Eliza," Cal said. He did not look up. She stopped sewing. "Yes, Caleb? Why do you flinch when I come into the room too quiet?" The question hung in the air. Eliza went very still. She poked the needle into the fabric and left it there. "I didn't know I did." She lied. "You do," Cal said. He looked at her then, his eyes dark and steady. "You do it when I move my hand too fast. You do it when a shadow falls across you. You are not just shy, Eliza. You are hunted." Eliza looked at the fire. The flames licked at the grate. She could feel the memory of the boarding house, the smell of gin, the heavy hand of the man who had claimed her. "There was a man," she said softly, "in Chicago. His name was Arthur. His father owned the factory." She took a breath, a shaky, shallow thing. "He saw me. He decided he wanted me. He didn't ask. He just encroached. He would wait for me outside the gates. He would follow me to the rooming house. He paid the landlord to give him a key." Cal stopped oiling the leather. His hands went still. "Did he hurt you?" Cal asked. His voice was very quiet, but it had a terrible edge to it. Eliza wrapped her arms around herself. Not with his fists. Not at first. He liked to make me afraid. He liked to corner me in the hallway. He would touch my hair, my face, and if I pulled away, he would laugh. He told me I had no choice. He told me I was poor, and he was rich, and that made me his. One night, he came into my room. He didn't finish it. I had a knife. I cut him. And then I ran. She looked up at Cal, her eyes wet but fierce. I ran because I knew the law would not help me. I ran because he told me he would break me until I thanked him for it. I flinch. Caleb, because for 2 years, touch was a threat. Cal stood up. He walked over to her. He did not touch her. He knelt beside her chair, putting himself lower than her. He is not here, Cal said. He is in my head, Eliza whispered. Then we will push him out, Cal said. He took a breath, looking down at his own hands, scarred and stained. I hesitate, Cal said. You see it. I second-guess everything. I see it, Eliza said. It was 7 years ago. The Lonesome Trail. We were crossing the Red River. The water was high. A boy, barely 18. His name was Toby. He got caught in the current. His horse went down. I was the closest. I had a rope. Cal closed his eyes, his face twisting in pain. I could have thrown it. I should have thrown it, but I looked at the water. I saw how fast it was moving. I thought about the physics of it. I thought about the risk. I hesitated, just for 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, a log hit him. He went under. We never found the body. He opened his eyes and looked at Eliza. I killed him with my thinking. I killed him because I was afraid to act. So now, I live here. I live small, because if I don't touch anything, I can't break it. Eliza reached out. She placed her hand on his cheek. His stubble was rough against her palm. You threw the rope for me, she said, when the log fell on you. When the town laughed. You didn't hesitate then. That was different. Cal said, No. Eliza said, It is the same. You are not that man anymore, Caleb, and I am not that girl in the rooming house. She leaned forward and kissed his forehead. It was a benediction. That night, their intimacy changed. It was no longer just 2 people seeking warmth. It was 2 wounded soldiers comparing scars. When they lay together in the narrow, creaking bed, Cal touched her with a reverence that made her throat ache. He asked for permission with his hands, waiting for her nod, waiting for her to relax. And Eliza, for the first time, let herself be held without waiting for the trap to spring. A week later, Cal began the work. He had been seasoning the wood for months, thick planks of white oak he had salvaged from a fallen barn 3 valleys over. He brought them into the cabin, filling the room with the scent of sawdust. He worked late into the night, by the light of the kerosene lamp. He planed the wood until it was as smooth as satin. He cut the joints with precision, refusing to use nails where a mortise and tenon would hold better. Eliza watched him. She saw the way he caressed the wood. She saw the determination in his shoulders. He was exorcising the ghost of the wire bed. He was building a monument. It took him 10 nights. When it was finished, it was a masterpiece of simplicity. 4 sturdy posts, a high headboard polished to a deep shine, and a frame that would not creak, would not sway, would not break. He set it up in the corner. He transferred the mattress. He stood back, his hands bleeding from splinters, his eyes red with fatigue. For you, he said. Eliza ran her hand over the footboard. It was solid. It felt permanent. For us, she corrected. The neighbors noticed. Of course they did. When the widow Gable came to visit, she saw the bed. She told Martha. Martha told the women at the store. He's buying lumber now. They whispered, Oak. Who does he think he is? A bed like that belongs in a mansion, not a shack. Resentment brewed. Poverty was supposed to be humble. Cal and Eliza were failing to perform their roles. They were rising, and that made the townspeople uncomfortable. It made them feel that perhaps their own unhappiness was not a mandate from God, but a failure of their own courage. Then came the turning point. It was a Tuesday in November. The wind was fierce, driving grit into the eyes of anyone foolish enough to be outside. Cal and Eliza had gone to town for the monthly supplies. They were loading sacks of grain into the wagon when the stagecoach arrived. It was the overland stage, dusty and battered. The door opened, and a passenger stepped out. He was not a local. He wore a heavy wool coat with a velvet collar, a bowler hat, and boots that were made for pavement. Not mud. He carried a leather valise. He stood on the boardwalk, brushing dust from his sleeve with an air of fastidious disgust. Eliza froze. She was holding a sack of coffee beans. Her fingers went numb. The man turned. He had a face that was soft but cruel, like a spoiling peach. He had a thin mustache and eyes that scanned the street with the boredom of a man who had seen everything and liked none of it. It was not Arthur. It was Mr. Sivney, Arthur's fixer. The man Arthur paid to find things he had lost. Eliza dropped the coffee sack. It hit the wooden planks with a dull thud. Cal spun around. Eliza? She couldn't breathe. Her lungs felt paralyzed. She saw Sivney walk toward the sheriff's office. He stopped a man on the street, Mr. Henderson, and asked a question. He mimed a height. He gestured to his hair. "He is here," Eliza whispered. The words were barely a sound. Cal looked at the man, then back at Eliza. He saw the terror in her face. It was absolute. She looked like a rabbit that hears the snap of a twig. "Get in the wagon," Cal said. His voice was low and hard. They drove out of town at a trot, not daring to gallop and draw attention. Eliza sat rigid, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her hands gripping her knees until the knuckles were white. "He found me," she said. "That man, he works for Arthur. He tracks people." "Did he see you?" Cal asked. "I don't know. I don't think so. But he will ask, and they will tell him." Cal's face was grim. "We can pack. Tonight. We can load the wagon and head west. Over the pass. We can be in Utah by the time the snow flies." Eliza looked at him. She looked at the man who had built a roof to shelter her. She looked at the hands that had built a bed to hold her. She thought of Martha. She thought of the garden she had turned from rock into soil. "Run," she said. "We have to," Cal said. "If he's here." "No," Eliza said. Cal looked at her, surprised. "Eliza?" "I'm tired. Caleb," she said. Her voice trembled, then steadied. "I ran from Chicago. I ran from the boarding house. I have been running my whole life. If we run now, we run forever. We will be sleeping in the dirt in Utah. We will be looking over our shoulders in California." She turned to him. The fear was still there, but beneath it was a bedrock of anger. "This is my home. You are my husband. I will not let them chase me out. I will not let them make me disappear again." Cal looked at her for a long time. He saw the steel in her spine. He nodded. "Then we stay," he said. But Rourke was already moving. The fixer, Sivney, had indeed spoken to the sheriff. He had shown a warrant, likely forged or bought, claiming that Eliza Hart was wanted for theft and assault in Chicago. He had money. He had the air of authority. Rourke found out within the hour. He sat in the sheriff's office, sipping whiskey, listening to Sivney's story. "So," Rourke said, swirling the amber liquid, "she's a criminal, a violent one. She cut a prominent citizen," Sivney said smoothly. "And she stole jewelry." Rourke smiled. "Of course she did." He looked at Sheriff Brady. "This changes things, doesn't it, Sheriff? It's not just about water anymore. It's about morality. It's about justice. Caleb Mercer is harboring a fugitive, a dangerous woman who has deceived our community." Brady nodded slowly. "He's aiding and abetting." "Exactly," Rourke said. "And a man like that, well, a man like that isn't fit to hold land. A man like that needs to be removed for the safety of the town." The trap had snapped shut. They didn't need to steal the deed anymore. They had the moral high ground. They could take the land, take the woman, and call it the law. Back at the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the snow that had begun to fall. Cal and Eliza stood in the center of the room. The new bed stood in the corner, a silent witness. "They are coming," Cal said. "Maybe not tonight, but soon." Eliza walked to the window. She watched the snow fall. It was beautiful and deadly. "Let them come," she said. She turned to Cal. She walked to him and wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his chest. "I love you," Caleb Mercer, she said. It was the first time she had said it. Cal went still. Then he crushed her to him, his arms like iron bands. I love you, Eliza, he said into her hair. They held each other as the light failed. It was a climax of emotion, a braiding together of fear and desire and a loyalty that defied logic. They knew, with a terrible clarity, that by choosing to stay, they had likely signed their own death warrants. The sheriff would come. Rourke would come. The man from Chicago would come. But they were together. End Part 3 with the threat closing in. Eliza saw a rider on the ridge, silhouetted against the dying light. He paused, watching the cabin, then turned and rode back toward town. The sheriff's interest had sharpened. The noose was tightening, and Cal's claim, with its warm stove and sturdy bed, suddenly felt less like a home and more like a grave they had dug for themselves. The snow began in the night, a silent, suffocating blanket that erased the world. By morning, the gray horizon had vanished, replaced by a wall of white that swirled and eddied like a living thing. The wind screamed through the cracks in the cabin walls, testing the mud chinking Cal had packed so carefully in the autumn. It was the kind of winter the old-timers spoke of with a shudder, the kind that froze cattle where they stood and turned a man's breath to ice in his beard before he could exhale. For Cal and Eliza, the cold was a besieging army. The woodpile, stacked high in October, was dwindling with terrifying speed. The flour barrel echoed when Eliza scraped the bottom for biscuits. But the cold was honest. It did not lie. It did not smile while it tried to kill you. Men were different. The arrest happened 3 days into the blizzard. The snow had paused, leaving the drifts hip-deep and the air sharp enough to cut glass. Sheriff Brady arrived with 4 deputies, their horses breasting the snow like ships in a heavy sea. They did not knock. They hammered on the door with the butts of their rifles. Cal opened it, a shotgun in the crook of his arm. Though the barrel was pointed at the floor, he saw the badges, the grim faces, and he knew. Step aside. Mercer, Brady said, his breath pluming in the cold air. What is this? Cal asked. We found 3 head of Miller's cattle in your south pasture, Brady said. Fresh brands worked over. Looks like you decided to help yourself to some winter beef. That is a lie, Cal said, his voice steady. I haven't been to the south pasture in a week. The drifts are too deep. Brady shrugged. The cows are there. The judge can decide the rest. Hand over the gun. Caleb, don't make me kill you in front of your wife. Eliza stepped up behind Cal. She was trembling, not from cold, but from a sudden, blinding rage. You know this is false, she said. Silas Rourke put them there. Or you did. Brady looked at her with cold, dead eyes. That is a dangerous thing to say to a lawman. Mrs. Mercer, take him. Boys, they seized Cal. They were rougher than they needed to be, wrenching his arms behind his back, cuffing his wrists with iron that bit into the skin. They dragged him out into the snow, throwing him onto a spare horse. Cal looked back at Eliza. His face was pale, but his eyes were fierce. Stay inside, he shouted over the wind. Keep the door barred. Don't open it for anyone. Then they were gone, a dark smudge disappearing into the white void, taking the heat and safety of the cabin with them. Eliza was alone. The silence of the cabin was deafening. Every creak of the timber sounded like a footstep. Every howl of the wind sounded like a scream. But Eliza Hart had not survived the textile mills and the boarding houses of Chicago to die of fright in a Dakota winter. She barred the door. She checked the load in the shotgun. She put on Cal's heavy coat, which swallowed her small frame, and went out to tend the horses. The work was brutal. The water in the trough had frozen solid and had to be broken with an axe. The hay had to be pitched with arms that ached from the cold. But the labor kept her warm. It kept her mind from unraveling. 2 days later, Silas Rourke came. He arrived in a sleigh drawn by 2 massive bays, bells jingling softly, a cheerful sound that felt obscene in the grim landscape. He walked to the door and knocked. A polite, gentleman's knock. Eliza opened the door, but she kept the chain fastened. She held the shotgun level with his chest. "Mrs. Mercer," Rourke said, tipping his beaverskin hat. "I heard about Caleb. A tragedy. Rustling is a hanging offense in these parts." "What do you want?" Eliza asked. "I came to offer aid." He said, "I hate to see a woman left alone to freeze. It sits poorly on my conscience." Eliza stared at him. "You have no conscience. Mr. Rourke, you have an appetite." Rourke's smile tightened. He leaned closer to the gap in the door. "I can help him. Eliza, I have influence with the judge. I could convince him that it was a misunderstanding, that perhaps the cattle wandered. All it would take is a signature." He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Sign the deed over to me," Rourke said. "The water rights in the land. I will give you enough money for a train ticket back east. You can leave this miserable place. You can be safe, and Caleb goes free." "And if I refuse?" Eliza asked. Rourke sighed. "Putting the paper away? Then the law takes its course. Caleb hangs. And you? Well, winter is long. Accidents happen. Fires start. A woman alone is very vulnerable. Mrs. Mercer, get off my porch," Eliza said. Rourke looked at the shotgun, then at her eyes. He saw no waver in either. He turned and walked back to his sleigh. That night, the war began. Eliza woke to the sound of shattering glass. A rock, wrapped in a burning rag, crashed through the small side window. It landed on the rug, flames licking at the wool. Eliza was out of bed before the glass stopped falling. She stomped the fire out with her boots. Ignoring the heat, she grabbed the gun and threw open the door, firing a blast into the dark. She heard a laugh, distant and mocking, and the sound of hoofbeats fading into the snow. She did not sleep again. She nailed a board over the broken window. She sat in the chair facing the door, the gun across her lap, watching the candle burn down. They wanted to terrify her. They wanted her to run screaming to Rourke, begging for protection. They did not know her. They thought she was a city girl, soft and easily bruised. They did not know that she had already been broken once, and in the healing, she had grown back as sharp as a splinter. She began to carry the Colt revolver Cal kept in the drawer. She practiced with it behind the barn, firing at fence posts until the recoil no longer made her flinch. She learned to read the snow for tracks. She learned to sleep in snatches, one eye open, listening for the snap of a twig. She was not just surviving. She was hunting for a way out. On Sunday, Eliza harnessed the wagon. The snow was deep, but the road to town had been packed down by traffic. She drove into Granite Springs with her head high, the revolver tucked into her belt beneath her coat. She did not go to the mercantile. She went to the edge of town, to the shack where Martha the midwife lived. Martha opened the door, took one look at Eliza's face, and pulled her inside. "You look like death warmed over, girl," Martha said, pouring a cup of bitter chicory coffee. "They took him." Eliza said, "It is a frame." "I know," Martha said. "The whole town knows. But knowing and saying are two different things. Rourke owns the sheriff. He owns the saloon. He owns half the council. I need proof," Eliza said. Martha shook her head. "Proof implies a court that cares for truth. We don't have one of those." "I need a witness," Eliza insisted. "Someone who saw them move the cattle. Someone who knows the deal Rourke made with Brady." Martha hesitated. She looked out the window, checking for listening ears. "Go see Thomas," she said softly. "The swamper at the Golden Steer. He hears things. People think he is simple, so they talk in front of him like he is a piece of furniture. But Thomas remembers." Eliza found Thomas in the alley behind the saloon, shivering as he chopped wood for the stoves. When he saw her, he ducked his head, ashamed of his twisted back and his poverty. "Thomas," Eliza said gently. "Mrs. Mercer," he stammered. I'm sorry about Cal. He was always kind to me. He gave me $1 once, just for holding his horse." Eliza stepped closer. "Thomas, did you hear anything? About the cattle? About Rourke?" Thomas looked around, his eyes wide with fear. "If I say, the sheriff will whip me." "He has done it before." Eliza took his rough hand in hers. She pulled off her glove so he could feel the warmth of her skin. "If Cal hangs, Thomas, Rourke wins. And if Rourke wins, no one is safe. Not me, not you. Thomas swallowed hard. He looked at her hand, then at her face. I was cleaning the office. He whispered, "The sheriff's office, Mr." Rourke was there. He gave the sheriff a pouch. Gold. I heard the clink. He said the cattle were moved on Tuesday night by the Crouch brothers. He said to wait until the snow covered the tracks before riding out. Eliza felt a surge of triumph, cold and sharp. "Will you tell the judge?" she asked. Thomas shrank back. "The judge drinks with Rourke. Misses. Mercer, he won't listen to a cripple." Eliza nodded. She knew he was right. Legal justice was a fantasy. She needed something else. She needed leverage. She went to the small church at the end of the street. The Reverend Josiah Hale was a new man, young and thin, with eyes that burned with the uncomfortable fire of true belief. He had not yet been bought. Eliza told him everything. She told him about the bribe. She told him about Thomas. She told him about the burning rag. "This is a sin," Josiah said, his voice trembling with indignation. "It is a rot in the soul of this town. Will you stand with me?" Eliza asked. "If I bring this to light, will you stand as a witness of God?" "I will," Josiah said, "but we need more than my word. We need the truth written down." Eliza went to the jail. Sheriff Brady was sitting at his desk, feet up, whittling a stick. He smirked when he saw her. "Visiting hours are over," he said. "I have a right to see my husband." Eliza said, "Or do you intend to deny a prisoner his rights in front of the Reverend?" She gestured to the window, where Josiah stood visibly on the boardwalk, a Bible in his hand. Brady scowled. He spat into the spittoon and grabbed a ring of keys. 5 minutes, he growled. He led her to the back. The cells were essentially iron cages in a stone room. It was freezing. Cal was sitting on a cot, wrapped in a thin, gray blanket. He looked gaunt. His face was bruised, and there was a cut above his eye that had scabbed over badly. "Caleb." He looked up. The relief in his eyes was so intense it nearly buckled her knees. He rushed to the bars. "Eliza, are you hurt? Did they hurt you?" "I am fine," she said, reaching through the bars to touch his face. Her fingers traced the bruise. "I am holding the claim. You shouldn't be here," Cal said, gripping her hand. "It isn't safe. Rourke? I know about Rourke." Eliza said, "I know about the bribe. Thomas told me." Cal's eyes widened. "Thomas? That boy will get himself killed. He is brave." Eliza said, "Braver than most." She pressed her forehead against the cold iron bars. They were so close, yet separated by an unyielding barrier. The smell of the jail, damp stone, unwashed bodies, and fear was overwhelming. "Caleb," she whispered, "I have to tell you something." "Not now," Cal said. "We don't have time." "I have to," she insisted, "because they are using my past against us. Rourke knows I ran. He is saying I am a criminal." "Let him talk," Cal said. "No," Eliza said. "You need to know. The man I ran from, his name was Arthur Vane. He was not just a man. He was a monster who thought he was a gentleman." She took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. "I didn't steal jewelry. Caleb, I stole myself back. He cornered me. He put his hands on me and told me I belonged to him because he had money and I had nothing. I took a knife from the supper tray. I cut his face. I wanted to leave a mark on him so the world would know he wasn't perfect." She looked at Cal, searching for judgment. She looked for the flinch she had seen in so many other men when she showed her sharpness. "I am not a thief," she said, "but I am violent. I did it, and I am not sorry." Cal looked at her. He did not pull his hand away. He tightened his grip. "You did what you had to do," he said. His voice was low, vibrating with a quiet, terrible anger, not at her, but for her. "You defended your life. That isn't a sin. Eliza, that is justice." "But I brought this on you," she said, a tear finally escaping, freezing on her cheek. "If I hadn't come, Rourke would just be a greedy neighbor. Now he has a weapon. He calls me immoral. He uses my shame to justify framing you." "You have no shame," Cal said firmly. You hear me? You have no shame. You are the finest thing in this wretched territory. If they come for you, they come through me. I am afraid." "Caleb," she whispered. "I know," he said. "I am too, but we are right, and that has to matter." Sheriff Brady banged on the door. "Time's up." They clung to each other for one desperate second, fingers interlaced, pouring all their fear and love into the touch. Then Cal pulled back. "Keep the gun close," he said. "Always," she replied. When Eliza stepped out of the jail, a man was waiting for her. He was standing by her wagon, smoking a thin cheroot. It was the man from the stagecoach. "The fixer, Mr. Sivney, Mrs. Mercer," he said, tipping his bowler hat. "Or should I say, Miss Hart?" Eliza stopped. She put her hand on the revolver beneath her coat. "Mr. Sivney," she said. "You know me. Good. Saves time." He flicked the ash from his smoke. "I have a proposition. Eliza, Mr. Vane is unhappy about the scar, but he is a pragmatic man. He wants you back in Chicago to answer for the assault. However, I look at this town, at this snow, and I think perhaps there is a simpler way." He reached into his pocket. Eliza tensed, drawing the hammer back on the revolver, but he only pulled out a train ticket. "One way to New York," he said, "and $500 in cash." He held it out. "You leave today. You disappear. You go east, far away from Arthur Vane and Silas Rourke. You start over." "And Caleb?" Eliza asked. "Caleb goes to prison for rustling." Sivney said, 5 years, maybe 10. "But he lives. If you stay." "Rourke is losing patience. He intends to burn you out. And Arthur wants a trial, a public one." Eliza looked at the ticket. It was freedom. It was an escape from the biting cold, the fear, the constant struggle to survive. She could go to New York. She could be anonymous again. She could sleep in a room where the wind didn't scream. She looked at the jailhouse. She thought of Cal's hand gripping hers. She thought of the bed he had built, sanding the wood until his fingers bled. She thought of the way he had looked at her when she confessed her violence, not with disgust, but with pride. Running meant agreeing with the world. It meant agreeing that she was disposable, that she was prey, that she deserved nothing but what she could steal. Running meant leaving the only man who had ever seen her as a human being. Eliza reached out. She took the ticket. Sivney smiled. "Smart girl." Eliza tore the ticket in half. Then she tore it again. She let the pieces flutter down into the mud and snow. "You tell Arthur Vane he can keep his scar," Eliza said, her voice ringing clear in the frozen street. "And you tell Silas Rourke that if he wants my land, he will have to kill me for it, because I am not going anywhere." Sivney's smile vanished. He looked at her with a cold, flat calculation. "You are making a mistake, Miss Hart, a fatal one." "My name is Mrs. Mercer," Eliza said. She climbed into the wagon. She did not look back. She snapped the reins, and the horses surged forward, pulling her away from the easy exit and back toward the storm, back to the empty cabin, and back to the fight that would decide whether they lived or died. The hearing was held in the back room of the Golden Steer Saloon, the only space in Granite Springs large enough to hold the spectacle. The air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco, wet wool, and the nervous sweat of a town that knew it was about to witness a hanging disguised as a legal proceeding. Judge Egan sat behind a table that had been scrubbed of beer stains for the occasion. He was a man with a face like a collapsed pudding, weary and pliable, brought in from the county seat on Rourke's dime. To his right sat Sheriff Brady, looking smug and polished, his badge catching the light of the kerosene lamps. To the left sat Caleb Mercer, his wrists still in iron cuffs, his face bruised and pale, but his eyes burning with a cold. Steady fire. The room was packed. Men stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Women, who usually avoided the saloon as a den of iniquity, crowded near the door, their curiosity overcoming their propriety. Silas Rourke sat in the front row, legs crossed, picking lint from his trousers. He looked bored. He looked like a man who had already read the last page of the book and knew exactly how it ended. Sheriff Brady stood up. hooking his thumbs into his gun belt. "Your Honor," he began, his voice booming for the crowd. "The facts are simple. We found 3 head of Miller's cattle in the Mercer pasture. The brands were altered, clumsily, I might add. It is a clear case of rustling by a man desperate for money. We ask for the maximum penalty," the crowd murmured. In the West, stealing a man's horse or his cattle was a sin greater than murder. Murder was often passion. Theft was a character flaw. Judge Egan peered over his spectacles. "Mr. Mercer, do you have anything to say?" Cal stood up. The chains rattled. "I did not take them," he said. His voice was rough, unused to pleading. The snow was too deep to move a herd. Anyone who works stock knows that. They were planted. Brady laughed. "Planted? That is a rich imagination. Son, who would plant good beef in a blizzard?" It was then that the door at the back of the room opened. A draft of freezing air cut through the smoke, silencing the murmurs. Eliza Mercer walked in. She was dressed in her best woolen skirt and a heavy coat, her hair pulled back severely. She looked small in the cavernous room, but she walked with the terrifying purpose of a woman who has burned her bridges. Behind her walked the Reverend Josiah Hale, clutching a Bible, and Thomas, the stable boy, who looked as if he might vomit from terror. "I have a witness," Eliza said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. Judge Egan frowned. "This is highly irregular. Mrs. Mercer, the sheriff has presented the evidence." "The sheriff has presented a lie," Eliza said. She walked to the front of the room, ignoring Rourke, who had stiffened in his chair. She turned to the crowd. She looked at the faces that had mocked her, the women who had shunned her. "You all know my husband," she said. "You know he is a quiet man. You know he works hard. But you also know Silas Rourke. You know he wants the water that runs through our land." She gestured to Thomas. "Thomas, tell the judge what you heard." Thomas stepped forward. He was shaking so hard his teeth clicked together. He looked at Rourke, then at the floor. I was in the alley," Thomas stammered. "Behind the office?" "Speak up, boy," Brady barked. Josiah Hale placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "The truth. Thomas, God is listening." Thomas took a breath. He squeezed his eyes shut. "I heard Mr. Rourke. He said, the words tumbling out. He gave the sheriff a bag of gold. I heard the coins clink. He told the sheriff to wait until the snow covered the tracks. He said the Crouch brothers moved the cattle on Tuesday night. The room exploded." Shouts of disbelief and anger clashed in the air. Rourke stood up, his face flushing a dark, angry red. "This is absurd," Rourke shouted over the noise. "You are going to take the word of a cripple and a mail-order bride over a pillar of the community." Sheriff Brady stepped forward, his hand dropping to his gun. "The boy is simple-minded, Your Honor, and the woman, well, we all know about the woman." He turned his sneer on Eliza. "We have a warrant from Chicago, Your Honor. This woman is a fugitive. She is wanted for assault and theft. She is a violent criminal who seduced this man and led him to ruin. She is a liar by trade. Are we to trust the word of that kind of woman?" The slur hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. It was designed to shame her, to strip her of her credibility by attacking her virtue. Eliza did not flinch. She did not look down. She stepped closer to Brady until she was within arm's reach. "I am a fugitive," she said clearly. The crowd went silent. "I ran from a man who thought his money gave him the right to own me. I cut him to save myself. If that makes me a criminal, then I am one, but I am not a liar. And I am not a thief." She turned to the judge. "My past is not on trial here. Judge, your sheriff's integrity is—" "Look at his face. Look at Mr. Rourke. They are afraid." "Because a stable boy told the truth." Judge Egan looked at the crowd. He saw the doubt in the eyes of the ranchers. He saw the Reverend standing like an avenging angel. He saw the mood shifting from a lynching to a riot. He was a corrupt man, but he was also a survivor. "Dismissed," Egan muttered, banging his gavel. "Insufficient evidence. Release the prisoner." It was not justice. It was a panicked retreat. Brady turned purple. "You can't just—" "I said release him," Egan snapped. "Get him out of here before this town tears itself apart." A deputy unlocked Cal's cuffs. Cal rubbed his wrists, looking at Eliza. He did not smile. He knew, and she knew, that this was not a victory. It was merely a delay. Rourke pushed his way through the crowd, stopping in front of Cal and Eliza. His veneer of politeness was gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian hatred. "You think this is over?" Rourke hissed. "You think you can embarrass me in my own town? Go home." "Silas," Cal said, stepping between Rourke and Eliza. Rourke laughed, a low, ugly sound. "You don't have a home? Mercer, you have a grave. You just haven't climbed into it yet." He stormed out, the sheriff trailing behind him like a whipped dog. Cal took Eliza's arm. "We have to go, now." They hurried out of the saloon, gathering Thomas and the Reverend. "You cannot stay in town." Cal told Thomas, "It isn't safe. I have nowhere to go." Thomas whispered. "Come with us," Eliza said. "We have the wagon." "No," Thomas said, shaking his head. I will hide in the church cellar. Reverend Hale said I could." "They won't look there. Go." Cal said, "Run." The ride back to the cabin was a gauntlet of tension. The wind had picked up again, driving snow across the road in blinding sheets. Cal drove the horses hard, his eyes scanning every ridge, every cluster of trees. They made it to the claim as the sun was bleeding out on the horizon, painting the snow in shades of violet and gray. The cabin stood dark and cold, the board over the broken window a stark reminder of the violence that had already touched them. They unhitched the horses and brought them into the barn, barring the door from the inside. They carried the guns into the house. "They won't wait," Cal said, checking the load in his Winchester rifle. "Rourke is humiliated. He won't let the sun rise on this." Eliza was melting snow on the stove for coffee. Her hands were steady, but her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "How many?" she asked. "Rourke, Brady, the Crouch brothers, maybe 2 or 3 hired guns. 6 men, maybe 7. We have 2 guns," Eliza said, "and 20 rounds of ammunition." Cal looked at her. The firelight cast deep shadows on his face. He looked older than his 29 years. "Eliza, if they breach the door—" "I know," she said. "I saved the last one for myself." Cal crossed the room and pulled her into him. It was a desperate embrace, fierce and terrified. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of her skin, trying to memorize her. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I brought you into this hell. You brought me home." "Caleb," she said, pulling back to look at him. "I chose this. I choose you." They did not have long to wait. 2 hours after dark, the wind brought a sound that was not nature. It was the heavy thud of hooves on frozen earth. Cal doused the lamp. The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the red glow of the stove vents. He moved to the window, peering through the crack in the shutter. "They are here," he said softly. A voice called out from the darkness. It was Brady. "Mercer, come out. We have a warrant for the woman. Don't make us burn you out." Cal smashed the glass of the window with the butt of his rifle and fired. The shot cracked like a whip in the cold air. A yelp of surprise answered him. "That's your answer," Cal shouted. The response was a volley of gunfire that chewed into the logs of the cabin. Bullets thudded against the wood, sending splinters flying into the room. Eliza crouched behind the overturned table, the revolver gripped in both hands. "Watch the back," Cal yelled, working the lever of his rifle. Eliza scrambled to the rear of the cabin. There was no window there, but there was a small ventilation hatch near the roof. She stood on a chair and peered out. She saw a shadow moving against the white snow. A man carrying a torch. "Fire!" she screamed. She aimed the revolver through the hatch and pulled the trigger. The gun kicked hard, the flash blinding her for a second. The man outside shouted and dropped the torch. It hissed into the snow, but another shadow was moving. They held them off for an hour. The cabin filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the dust shaken from the rafters. The cold poured in through the broken window, freezing the sweat on their skin. Then, the shooting stopped. The silence was sudden and terrifying. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of the plains. "Are they reloading?" Eliza whispered, her ears ringing. "I don't know," Cal said. He wiped blood from his cheek where a splinter had cut him. Then, A sound cut through the wind. A scream. Not of anger, but of pure, high-pitched agony. It came from the yard. "Help me! Please, God, help me!" It was Thomas. Cal froze. "Thomas?" Eliza scrambled to the window. In the pale moonlight reflecting off the snow, she saw a shape writhing on the ground near the gate. It was the boy. Rourke's men had found him. They had dragged him here. "He's bait!" Cal hissed. "They want us to come out! Help me!" Thomas shrieked again. "They broke my legs! Caleb!" The sound tore through Cal. This boy who had saved them, who had stood up in the saloon and told the truth, was being tortured in the snow to draw them out. "I have to go," Cal said. He stood up, his eyes wild. "No," Eliza grabbed his arm. "It is a trap. Caleb, they will cut you down the moment you step on the porch. I can't let him die like that," Cal shouted, struggling against her grip. Eliza slammed him back against the wall, her small hands bunched in his coat. "If you go out there, you die, and then Thomas dies anyway, and then they come for me. Do you understand?" Cal stared at her, his chest heaving. The screams outside continued, weaker now, sobbing. "Then what do we do?" Cal choked out. "We shoot the lights out," Eliza said, her voice hard as iron. "We make it dark, and we wait for them to make a mistake." But they didn't have to wait. A gunshot rang out from the darkness, distinct, closer to the boy. The screaming stopped abruptly. The silence returned. "He's gone," Cal whispered. The horror in his voice was absolute. "They killed him, just to show us they could." The brutality of it, the senseless, casual cruelty, broke something in the night. The attackers had overplayed their hand. They had expected fear. They had created a monster. Cal sank to the floor, the rifle slipping from his hands. He put his head in his knees. A sound torn from his throat, a dry, ragged sob, filled the room. Eliza did not cry. She felt a coldness settle into her marrow that had nothing to do with the winter. She crawled to Cal. She wrapped her arms around him, rocking him as the wind howled outside. They held each other in the dark, surrounded by the wreckage of their home. This was their intimacy now, not soft words or gentle touches, but the fierce, bloody clinging of two survivors on a life raft. It was a refuge, yes, but it was also a rebellion. By refusing to break, by refusing to turn on each other, they were defying the cruelty that demanded their submission. When dawn broke, the world was gray and silent. The attackers had withdrawn, likely to warm themselves and regroup for a final assault. Cal stood up. He walked to the door and unbarred it. "Caleb?" Eliza asked. He did not answer. He walked out onto the porch. He walked through the snow to the gate. Thomas lay there. He was small in the drift, his body twisted, a single bullet hole in his chest. His eyes were open, staring at the sky. Cal knelt. He closed the boy's eyes. He picked him up. Thomas weighed almost nothing, a bundle of rags and bone. Cal carried him back to the cabin. He laid him on the porch. Then he went to the barn and began to hitch the horses to the wagon. Eliza came out. She saw his face. It was a mask of granite. There was no fear left in it. There was only a terrible, focused clarity. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I am taking him to town," Cal said. "They will kill you. Let them try," Cal said. He did not raise his voice. "I am done hiding. Eliza." "I am done running. I am taking this boy to the sheriff's doorstep, and I am going to end it." Eliza looked at him. She saw the darkness that threatened to consume him, the vengeance that had ruined the men she knew in the city. But she also saw the justice in it. She went into the house. She came out with the shotgun and the revolver. She climbed onto the wagon seat. "Then we go together," she said. Granite Springs was waking up. Shopkeepers were sweeping the boardwalks. The sun was trying to break through the clouds. The wagon rolled down the main street. It was a ghostly sight. The horses were breathing steam. Cal and Eliza sat on the bench, covered in soot and blood. And in the back, wrapped in a quilt, lay the body of a boy. People stopped. Silence rippled down the street like a wave. Cal pulled the horses up in front of the sheriff's office. He set the brake. He got down. He walked to the back of the wagon and lifted Thomas's body. He walked up the steps of the jail and laid the boy down in front of the door. Then he stepped back and shouted, "Brady! Rourke! Get out here!" The door opened. Sheriff Brady stepped out, a coffee cup in his hand. He froze when he saw the body. Rourke appeared behind him, looking impeccable in his suit. He looked at the boy, then at Cal. "A tragic accident," Rourke said loudly. Addressing the gathering crowd, "The boy must have got caught in the crossfire. We told you, Mercer is dangerous. Liar!" Cal's voice cracked like a thunderclap. He pointed a shaking finger at Rourke. "You sent your dogs to my house. You tortured this boy in my yard to make me come out. You executed him because he told the truth." "That is slander," Brady shouted, reaching for his gun. "You are under arrest for murder." Cal didn't move. He stood his ground, his hand hovering near his own holster. But it was Eliza who spoke. She stood on the wagon seat, the shotgun resting on her shoulder. "Look at the boy," she screamed at the town. "Look at him! He swept your floors. He chopped your wood. Was he dangerous? Was he a threat?" The crowd surged forward. They looked at Thomas's small, broken body. They looked at the blood on the snow. "Mrs." Gable pushed her way to the front. "That is Thomas," she whispered. He fixed my fence last week. He was a good boy." Martha the midwife shouted from the back. "And you killed him." The mood turned. It shifted from curiosity to horror, and then to anger. This was not a dispute over water rights anymore. This was the slaughter of an innocent. This was a line crossed. Rourke sensed the change. He saw the way the men were looking at him, not with fear, but with disgust. "Sheriff," Rourke barked. "Arrest them! Shoot them if they resist!" Brady drew his gun. Cal drew faster. It was a motion born of 7 years of repressed rage. The colt cleared leather and barked once. The gun was shot out of Brady's hand. The sheriff yelped, clutching his shattered fingers, dropping to his knees. Rourke panicked. He saw the wall of the community closing in. He saw Cal's gun turn toward him. He reached inside his coat, pulling a small derringer. "Cal!" Eliza shouted. Cal fired again. The bullet caught Rourke in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fell hard against the wall of the jail, sliding down to the boardwalk, clutch in his wound. Cal walked up the steps. He stood over Rourke. He cocked the hammer of the Colt. "Do it!" Rourke gasped, grinning through blood. "Make yourself a murderer. Hang for it." Cal looked down the sights. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. He wanted to wash the memory of Thomas's screams away with Rourke's blood. His finger tightened on the trigger. "Caleb!" Eliza's voice cut through the red haze. She had climbed down from the wagon. She stood at the bottom of the steps. "Don't," she said. "He isn't worth your soul." Cal looked at her. He saw the woman who had come from the city with nothing but a carpetbag and a knife. He saw the partner who had held him through the fever. He saw the reason he wanted to live. He slowly lowered the hammer. He holstered the gun. "He is yours," Cal said to the town. The crowd moved in. Hands grabbed Rourke. Hands grabbed the sobbing sheriff. It was not a lynch mob, not quite. It was a community taking out the trash. Judge Egan appeared in the doorway, pale and shaking. He looked at the scene, the wounded tycoon, the broken sheriff, the dead boy, and the silent, armed couple. "Take them into custody." Egan squeaked. I will send for the U.S. Marshal." It was imperfect justice. Rourke would likely hire expensive lawyers. Brady might survive his hand. But their power was broken. The fear was gone. The spell they had cast over Granite Springs had been shattered by the body of a boy and the courage of a poor homesteader. They buried Thomas 3 days later on a small hill overlooking the valley. The ground was frozen, so they piled stones over the grave. Reverend Hale read the scripture, his voice thin in the wind. Almost the whole town came. They stood in the cold, heads bowed. "Mrs." Gable cried. "Mr. Henderson," the shopkeeper, looked at his boots, ashamed. Cal and Eliza stood apart. They held hands, their grip tight. They were changed. Cal walked with a permanent limp now, the cold settling deep into his mended leg. His face was lined. the youth finally and completely eroded. He looked like the land itself, hard, weathered, and enduring. Eliza had lost the softness of her city skin. Her eyes were older. She scanned the horizon not with fear, but with vigilance. She stood differently, grounded, weight distributed, ready to move or fight. After the service, people tried to speak to them. They offered apologies, casseroles, help with the barn roof. Cal nodded, polite but distant. Eliza thanked them, but her smile did not reach her eyes. They accepted the peace, but they would not forget the war. They rode back to the cabin in silence. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the snow. The cabin was battered, the logs scarred by bullets, the window boarded up, but smoke curled from the chimney. Cal stopped the wagon. He looked at the house. "It needs work," he said. "We have time," Eliza said. She touched his arm. He looked at her. "We survived. Caleb, we did," he said. He helped her down. They walked to the porch, stepping over the dark stain where Thomas had lain. They would scrub it later. For now, it was a reminder. Cal opened the door. The warmth of the stove rushed out to meet them. They stepped inside and closed the door against the wind. They were older. They were scarred. They were no longer the poor cowboy and the mail-order bride who had been the punchline of a joke. They were the Mercers. And as they unbuttoned their coats and moved to light the lamp, the west outside howled and clawed at the walls, finding no way in. The thaw did not arrive as a trumpet blast of warmth, but as a slow, weeping surrender of the ice. For weeks, the high plains were a landscape of gray slush and mud that sucked the boots off a man's feet. The creek, which had been a silent ribbon of white for months, broke its throat open and roared with meltwater, carrying chunks of ice the size of wagon wheels downstream. It was April of 1885. The violence of the winter had receded, leaving behind a world that felt tender and bruised. The air smelled of wet earth, rotting leaves, and the sharp, green scent of new grass pushing up through the debris of the storm. Caleb Mercer stood on the porch of the cabin, a hammer in his hand. The wood beneath his boots was scarred with bullet holes, dark pockmarks that told the story of the night they had nearly died. He did not sand them away. He left them there, not as a shrine to the fear, but as a map of what they had survived. He was thinner. The winter had taken the last of the softness from him, leaving only bone and sinew. His leg, broken the previous autumn, still ached when the pressure changed, a dull throb that would likely walk with him to his grave. But his eyes were different. The hunted look was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady light, like a lantern burning in a windless room. He stepped off the porch, his boots squelching in the mud. He walked to the corral. The fence had been partially torn down during the siege, rails splintered by gunfire or dragged away for firewood. He picked up a fresh pine pole, stripped of its bark, and hoisted it onto his shoulder. Eliza was in the garden. She was wearing a dress of calico that had been patched 3 times at the hem. Her boots were caked with mud, and her hands were brown with soil. She was planting peas, pressing the wrinkled seeds into the cold, wet ground with a faith that defied logic. She looked up as Cal passed. She did not smile, not a wide, beaming smile. Those were for people who had not seen what they had seen. Instead, she offered him a look of profound, quiet recognition. It was a look that said, "I see you. You are here. We are still standing." "Coffee is on," she said, her voice carrying easily in the still air. "I will finish this rail," Cal said. "Then I will come in. Don't work until you drop, Caleb. The fence will wait. The fence will wait." Cal agreed, "But the cows won't." He watched her for a moment. She went back to the soil, her movements efficient and strong. She was no longer the frightened girl from the train station, clutching a carpet bag and looking for an exit. She was part of the land now. She had bled into it, and it had bled into her. They were rebuilding. It was not a grand restoration. They did not have the money for new lumber or glass panes to replace every scratched surface. They used what they had. Cal straightened the barn door. Rehanging it on leather hinges he cut from an old saddle. Eliza scrubbed the soot from the walls. though the faint smell of smoke lingered in the cabin like a memory. They were hammering their world back into shape, one nail at a time. It was honest work. It was the work of reclaiming a life that others had tried to declare forfeit. The town of Granite Springs had changed, too, though human nature was slower to thaw than the ice. When Cal and Eliza rode into town 2 weeks after the snow melted, the reception was not warm, but it was no longer hostile. The fear that Silas Rourke had cultivated, the idea that Cal was a dangerous drifter and Eliza a fallen woman, had evaporated in the face of the truth. Rourke was gone, sent to a hospital in Denver to nurse his shattered shoulder. And then, rumor said, to face a federal inquiry that would likely strip him of his holding. Sheriff Brady was no longer wearing the star. He sat on his porch, nursing a mangled hand, a ghost in his own town. But prejudice was a habit, and habits were hard to break. Eliza walked into the mercantile with a basket of eggs to trade. Mr. Henderson was behind the counter. He looked at her, then looked away, shifting his weight uncomfortably. Mrs. Mercer, he mumbled. Mr. Henderson, Eliza said. She placed the basket on the counter. 2 dozen, fresh. Henderson looked at the eggs. He looked at the woman. He remembered the way he had denied her change. He remembered the way he had laughed when Rourke made jokes about her virtue. He cleared his throat. It sounded like dry leaves rattling. I can offer you 40 cents a dozen, he said. The going rate is 25. Eliza said, I know. Henderson said. He looked her in the eye for the first time. It was a fleeting, terrified glance, but it was there. Call it a premium. For quality. Eliza looked at him. She saw the shame sitting on his shoulders. She could have thrown it back in his face. She could have demanded an apology. But she knew that for a man like Henderson, admitting the price was wrong was as close as he would ever get to admitting the sin was his. 30 cents, Eliza said. I do not want charity. Mr. Henderson, I want fairness. Henderson blinked. He nodded slowly. 30 cents. As she left the store, she passed Mrs. Gable. The widow stopped. She looked at Eliza's coat, which was clean but threadbare. Mrs. Mercer, the widow said. Mrs. Gable. My fence, the widow said, staring at a point over Eliza's shoulder. The one Thomas fixed. The frost heaved a post. I cannot lift it. I will tell Caleb. Eliza said, he will come by on Tuesday. Thank you, Mrs. Gable said. And then, in a voice so low, Eliza almost missed it. He was a good boy. Thomas, he was, Eliza said. That was the victory. Not a parade, not a public declaration of innocence, but the slow, grinding shift of a town forced to look at its own ugliness and blink. Some people still crossed the street to avoid them. Some still whispered that a woman who could shoot a man was unnatural, but they whispered it with fear now. Not contempt, they respected the steel, even if they did not understand the forge it came from. Cal felt the change internally. For 7 years, his sleep had been a landscape of drowning horses and muddy rivers, a replay of the moment he had hesitated and a boy had died. But now, when he closed his eyes, he saw Thomas. It was a different kind of pain, sharp and clean, devoid of the paralyzing guilt. He had not hesitated with Thomas. He had carried him. He had stood up. He found himself laughing at odd moments. It was a rusty sound, surprising him as much as it surprised the horses. One evening, he was watching Eliza try to wrestle a stubborn sheet onto the clothesline in a high wind. The wet fabric whipped around her, wrapping her like a mummy. She fought it, sputtering, her hair flying in her face. Cal leaned against the porch post and chuckled. You find this amusing, Mr. Mercer? Eliza called out, struggling to free her arm. I find it inspiring, Cal said, grinning. It is a battle of wills. I have my money on the sheet. Eliza stopped fighting. She stood there, wrapped in white cotton, and looked at him. She saw the crinkles at the corners of his eyes. She saw the way his shoulders had dropped from their perpetual defensive hunch. You are laughing, she said. Cal shrugged. I reckon I am. It is a good sound, she said. She freed herself and pinned the sheet with a savage snap. Cal walked out to her. He took the next sheet from the basket. Allow me, he said. I have experience wrangling things that do not want to be caught. They worked together, pinning the laundry in the wind. It was such an ordinary thing. A year ago, Cal would have done it alone, in silence, feeling the emptiness of the world pressing in. Now, it was a shared task, a small domestic ritual that felt like a sacrament. Eliza found her own dignity in these moments. She baked bread, kneading the dough with a violence that exercised the memories of Arthur Vane and the Chicago mills. She walked into town with her head high, refusing to shrink, refusing to apologize for her existence. She had learned that dignity was not something given by a judge or a rich husband. It was something you manufactured yourself, from the raw materials of survival and self-respect. But the true center of their rebuilding was the bed Cal had built in the autumn, the one made of white oak and desperation, had survived the attack. It stood in the corner of the cabin, unshaken. But it was unfinished. The wood was smooth, but it lacked the final touches Cal had promised. On a rainy Sunday, when the fields were too wet to work, Cal took a tin of beeswax and a soft cloth. He sat by the bed and began to polish the wood. Eliza sat nearby, mending a sock. She watched him work. The smell of the wax was sweet and earthy. "It is a good bed," she said. "It is strong," Cal said. He rubbed the wood in slow, rhythmic circles. "But it needs to be finished. I want it to last. I want our children to know this was built with care." Eliza's needle stopped. She looked at him. The word hung in the air, heavy with promise. Children. It was a future he had never dared to speak of before. Cal looked up. He stopped polishing. He said, his voice dropping, "If that is something, it is," Eliza said softly. She put the mending down. She walked over to the bed. She sat on the edge of the mattress. Cal put the wax tin on the floor. He sat beside her. The rain drummed on the roof, a steady, comforting rhythm. The cabin was warm. The lamp cast a golden circle around them. They looked at each other. There was no desperate hunger now, no frantic grasping for comfort in the face of death. There was only a deep, abiding gravity. "I used to hate this room," Cal said. "I used to hate the silence." "And now?" Eliza asked. "Now it is the only place in the world I want to be, because you are in it." He reached out and touched her face. His hand was rough, scarred, and stained with work. It was the hand of a man who could build a fence, break a horse, and kill a tyrant. But on her skin, it was gentle. Eliza turned her face into his palm. She closed her eyes. "I am not afraid anymore." "Caleb," she whispered. "Not of the dark, not of the quiet, and not of wanting you." Cal leaned in. He kissed her. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was a claiming, not of ownership, but of partnership. It was an acknowledgement that they had walked through the fire and come out the other side, not as ash, but as steel. They lay back on the bed. The oak frame held them without a creak. It was solid. It was silent. It was a fortress they had built from shame and turned into a sanctuary. In the intimacy of that afternoon, while the rain washed the world clean outside, they found a joy that needed no apology. It was not the frantic coupling of animals trying to survive. It was the deliberate, beautiful union of two people who had looked death in the face and chosen life. Their desire was not dirty. It was proof. It was the ultimate defiance against a world that had tried to crush them. They were alive. They were together. And they were home. The final test came in late May. The grass was knee-high, a lush, vibrant green that rippled under the wind like the sea. The wildflowers were blooming, blue flax and Indian paintbrush, painting the hills in riots of color. Cal and Eliza were sitting on the porch as the sun went down. The work of the day was done. The horses were fed. The garden was watered. A figure appeared on the road. It was not a neighbor. It was not a merchant. It was a walker. As the figure got closer, they saw it was a girl. She could not have been more than 14. She was dressed in rags that had once been a dress. Her shoes were wrapped in burlap. She walked with a limp, her head down, carrying a small bundle tied with string. She stopped at the gate. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the man and woman sitting on the porch. She looked ready to run. She looked like a cornered animal, expecting a stone or a curse. Cal and Eliza exchanged a look. In that glance, 1,000 words passed between them. They remembered the train station. They remembered the laughter of the Crouch brothers. They remembered Thomas, shivering in the alley. They remembered the cold, hollow ache of being alone and disregarded. They could have sent her away. They had barely enough for themselves. The winter had drained their stores. A mouth to feed was a burden, but the West had not made them cruel. It had made them spacious. Eliza stood up. She walked down the steps. She walked to the gate. The girl flinched. She took a half step back, her eyes wide and terrified. "I ain't begging," the girl said, her voice raspy with dust. "I can work. I can scrub. I just need water." Eliza opened the gate. "What is your name?" Eliza asked. "Sarah," the girl whispered. "Well, Sarah," Eliza said, "we have water, and we have stew. It is rabbit, and it is hot." The girl stared at her. You would let me eat?" "I would," Eliza said. She reached out her hand. "Come inside." The girl looked at the hand. She looked at Cal, who had stood up and was watching with a quiet nod. She looked at the open door of the cabin, where the warm yellow light spilled out into the blue twilight. She took Eliza's hand. They walked up the path together. Cal held the door open. He looked at the girl, and he saw the echo of Eliza. He saw the echo of himself. "Welcome," Cal said. Sarah walked into the cabin. She looked at the sturdy table. She looked at the fire in the stove. She looked at the bed in the corner, with its polished oak posts and clean quilt. She began to cry, silent, shaking sobs of relief. Eliza guided her to a chair. She ladled a bowl of stew. She cut a slice of the bread she had baked that morning. Cal sat opposite them. He watched his wife feeding the stranger. He felt a swelling in his chest that was painful in its sweetness. This was their place in the West. They had not claimed it with a deed or a gun, though they had those things. They had claimed it with this, with the refusal to close the door, with the decision that their suffering would not make them hard, but would make them a shelter for others who suffered. They were not rich. They would never be the cattle barons who ruled the territory. They would always have to fight the wind and the drought and the frost. But they had won. Night fell fully over the high plains. The wind kicked up, rustling the grass, singing its old, lonely song through the wires of the fence. The stars came out, hard and bright diamonds scattered across the infinite black velvet of the sky. To a hawk flying overhead, the land was a vast emptiness, a sea of darkness stretching from horizon to horizon. But in the center of that darkness, there was a light. It burned in the window of a small, timber cabin. It was steady. It was warm. Inside, the lamp illuminated a room that was clean and mended. It shone on a bed built of white oak, strong enough to last 100 years. It shone on a young girl sleeping by the stove, safe for the first time in her life. And it shone on a man and a woman standing by the window, looking out at the night. Cal put his arm around Eliza. She leaned her head against his shoulder. They did not speak. They did not need to. They listened to the wind, and they did not fear it. They were the neighbors who had been laughed at. They were the poor cowboy and the desperate bride. They were the punchline that had become a prayer. They stood there, two silhouettes against the glass, anchored by the roots they had driven into the rock. The West was vast, and it was cruel, and it gave nothing freely. But they had carved a space in it. They had built a home from the wreckage of their lives. And as the wind swept over the grass, rushing toward the mountains, it passed over a house that would not fall, occupied by two people who were still standing, together. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust, the snow, and the resilience of the human heart. And I am grateful you walked this path with Cal and Eliza. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment and share your location with our community. If you enjoyed this tale of the American West, please consider subscribing to From Wild West so you never miss a new story. And finally, I invite you to share your thoughts in English in the comments below. Tell me what you felt, what you saw, and what this story meant to you. Until next time, keep your lamp burning.